Good evening, everyone. Thank you. My name is Sharon Rabb, and I'm the founder of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. And on behalf of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Foundation, our brand new executive director, Nick Rains, our advisory council, I want to welcome you. Nick has met every challenge that has been thrown at him in this extraordinary year, and believe me, the challenges just kept coming. This day was a long time coming. As people, we have shared and still are sharing an extraordinary life during COVID. This event has been planned 3 times over 2 years, and it feels so good to finally be standing here in person and to say, welcome. Thank you for joining us here on this November afternoon to talk about words, to talk about peace, to talk about the way that words can lead to peace. There will be countless words shared here today, and we hope that you take some of them home with you, and that they inspire you, challenge you, change you, and comfort you. We have many to thank for bringing us this event into reality, chiefly among them the major sponsors of this afternoon, Stephen and Rhonda Shamble of Iron Gate Realtors. We would not be here without your generous support. We also want to thank Larry and Marilyn Claiborne and Morris Home Furnishings for helping us set the stage. You'll see that mostly in Act 2. We want to thank the dozens and dozens of volunteers who have worked for hours to bring you this event. And most importantly, we want to thank the authors who have traveled during still dangerous times to be with us here tonight. We have an unprecedented number of international guests. Alexander Starritt, part Scot, part German, who traveled from London in spite of the birth of his son, Wolfgang, last week. We thank Alexander's wife, Stella, for his presence here this evening. Venezuelan Ariana Neumann joins us from London, as does Cypriot Christy Lefteri, joining us virtually, having been advised by her doctor not to travel at 7 months pregnant. Nguyen Phan Quay Mai, born in North Vietnam, travels the farthest from I hope I'm saying this right, Kyrgyzstan. Margaret Atwood joins us from across the border in Canada. And we will be missing Iranian-born Golnaz Hashemzada Bandi, who found out on Monday that she was unable to join us from Sweden to present the Fiction Awards. We learned only weeks ago that this wonderful international chorus of voices would be able to enter the country to join us here. So we are especially delighted that they are here. Israeli-American Moriel Rothman-Zecher joins us from Yellow Springs. And we have writers here from Tennessee, California, North Carolina, New York, and Massachusetts, and we welcome them all to Dayton, Ohio. The DLPP believes that reading literary fiction and nonfiction leads to enlightenment, that enlightenment can lead to empathy, that empathy necessitates justice, and that justice is essential to achieving peace. Today we'll be enlightened, and perhaps we'll become empathetic to the people, characters, and situations described in these books. The movement to justice and peace rests on the readers' shoulders. The writers have done their job. Now we must do ours. Among the many writers who have graced our stage, there are few who have walked the talk better than our MC for the weekend, Gilbert King. Gilbert King was the 2013 Dayton Literary Peace Prize Nonfiction Runner-Up for the Pulitzer Prize-winning book Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and The Dawn of a New America. His companion book, Beneath the Ruthless Sun, a true story of violence, race, and justice lost and found, continues the story of Orange County, Florida, a place many of us equate with innocence and fun and fantasy, but an area that held dark secrets of a tragic past, secrets that Gilbert worked to reveal even when personally threatened. When I say he walks the talk, I mean after the awards and after the book sales and celebrations, Gilbert continued to work with the families of the accused Groveland Four and did not give up until the men were exonerated. He continues his fight against injustice through a new series focused on finding a killer and exonerating another man wrongfully accused. He is as dedicated to peace and justice as any man I know. The fact that he has had a 2 handicap in golf is no shabby detail either. Please join me in welcoming our host for the evening, the man who has become the voice of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, Gilbert King.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be back in Dayton to see, well, I don't even see your faces. You're in the dark right now, but it feels like a Zoom meeting, sort of, and you're all in black. But we're going to get started. Let's welcome the authors. I'm going to just do an introduction of who the authors are who are seated here today, and then we're going to start with some questions that we've put together here, and then we'll have some audience questions, too, that we've already got up here already, so you don't have to raise your hands, but let's start out. Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt is a professor of psychology at Stanford University and a 2014 MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant recipient. She has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and was named one of the Foreign Policy's 100 Leading Global Thinkers. She is co-founder and co-director of Spark, a Stanford center that brings together researchers and practitioners to address significant social problems. Dr. Eberhardt is the Dayton Literary Peace Prize 2020 runner-up for nonfiction for her book, Biased. Right here. Jordan Ritter Conn is a staff writer for The Ringer, where he writes about sports, culture, and national and international affairs. His stories at The Ringer included features on civil unrest in Hong Kong, the grief of Breonna Taylor's family after her killing by police, and the work of hospital chaplains during the COVID-19 pandemic. He previously worked at Grantland and ESPN, the magazine, and he's written for the New York Times and Sports Illustrated. He's the host of a narrative podcast series, What If? The Len Bias Story, and Sonic Boom, which was named one of the best podcasts of 2019 by The Atlantic. He is a 2-time finalist for the Livingston Award, and his work has been cited or recognized by The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and Slate. An alumnus of Lee University and the University of Southern California at Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, John currently lives in Nashville with his wife, Beth. He is currently writing a book about the pressures and performance of masculinity in America. Jordan is the Dayton Literary Peace Prize 2021 runner-up for nonfiction for his book, The Road from Raqqa. Chanel Miller is the 2020 winner for nonfiction of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Ariana Neumann was born and grew up in Venezuela. She has a Bachelor of Arts in History and French Literature from Tufts University, an MA in Spanish and Latin American Literature from New York University, and a PGDIP, did I pronounce that correctly? Okay, in Psychology of Religion and University of London. She previously was involved in publishing, worked as a foreign correspondent for Venezuela's The Daily Journal, and her writing has appeared in a variety of publications, including the European, the Jewish Book Council, and the New York Times. She currently lives in London with her husband, 3 children. This is going to be good. Bassif Fall de Bretagne? I don't know. That's a border terrier and a rescue mutt. Okay. When Time Stopped is her first book, and Ariana is the 2021 winner for nonfiction of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Brought up in London, Christy Lefteri is the child of Cypriot refugees. She holds a PhD in creative writing from Brunel University, where she is now a lecturer. Her first novel, the international bestseller The Beekeeper of Aleppo, was born out of her time working as a volunteer at a UNICEF-supported refugee center. She's also the author of A Watermelon, A Fish, and a Bible, which was longlisted for the Impact Dublin Literary Award. Christy is the Dayton Literary Peace Prize 2020 runner-up for fiction for her novel, The Beekeeper of Aleppo. Born into the Vietnam War in 1973, Nguyen Phan Quay Mai grew up witnessing the war's devastation and its aftermath. She worked as a street seller and rice farmer before winning a scholarship to attend university in Australia. She is the author of 8 books of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction in Vietnamese, and her writing has been translated and published in more than 15 countries. She's been honored with some of the top literary awards of Vietnam, including the Poetry of the Year 2010 award from the Hanoi Writers Association. Her debut novel and first book in English, The Mountains Sing, was awarded a Lenin Literary Awards Fellowship for contribution to peace and reconciliation and Browse Book Best Debut Award for 2020. It was named a Best Book of 2020 by more than 10 media establishments, including NPR. Quay Mai has a PhD in creative writing from Lancaster University, and she is this year's Dayton Literary Peace Prize 2021 runner-up for nonfiction. Alice Hoffman is the 2020 winner for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for fiction with her novel, The World That We Knew, and the author of more than 30 works of fiction, including Magic Lessons, Practical Magic, The Rules of Magic, the Oprah's Book Club selection Here on Earth, The Red Garden, The Dove Keepers, The Museum of Extraordinary Things, The Marriage of Opposites, and Faithful. She lives near Boston. Alice Hoffman. Alexander Starritt's first novel, The Beast, a loving satire of Britain tabloid newspaper, was published in 2017. The Spectator named it as the book of the year, calling it irresistible, while the Sunday Times said, he proves that he is not only a very funny writer, but possesses the ruthless unsentimentality of the finest satirists. His second novel, We Germans, a story of German soldiers in the Second World War, was published in 2020. The New York Times said, Starritt's daring work challenges us to lay bare our histories, to seek answers from the past, and to be open perspectives starkly different from our own. Starritt has also been translated works by Franz Kafka, Stefan Zweig, Arthur Schnitzler, and others into English. In particular, he made a selection and translation of Kafka's best stories titled The Unhappiness of Being a Single Man. Starritt was born in northeast Scotland. He has lived in Italy, where he worked for the Santa Maddalena Literary Foundation, and in Germany. He now lives in London with his family. Alex is the Dayton Literary Peace Prize 2021 winner in fiction for We Germans. And Moriel Rothman-Zecher is a Jerusalem-born novelist and poet. His first novel, Sadness is a White Bird, was finalist for the 2019 Dayton Literary Peace Prize and National Jewish Book Award, the winner of the Ohioana Book Award, and longlisted for the Center for Fiction's first novel prize. Moriel's poetry and essays have been published in Barrel House, The Common, The New York Times, the Paris Reviews Daily, and Ziziva, and he is the recipient of the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 honor, 2 McDowell Fellowships, and Yiddishkeit Wallace Annenberg Helix Fellowship. Wow, I did that. Moriel lives in Yellow Springs, Ohio with his wife Kayla and their daughter Nahar. His second novel is forthcoming from Farrar, Straus, and Giroux in fall of 2022. Moriel. All right, so now we'll begin the fun. We have a few questions. We're going to run them through. Each author is going to give their own interpretive answer to this question, and then we'll go to the author questions. And let's just get started. Let's start down here. You know, the writing process and doing research and interviews for your books, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, whether it's past works or works that are currently in progress, I'm just curious if there's anything that you can think of that surprised you or enlightened you in ways that you may have not expected when you began the journey to this research project or novel. You want to start, Jennifer?
Sure, I'm happy to start.
I love it.
Well, I can think of many different stories I could tell, but I'll tell the one about Tiffany Crutcher. She is someone I met as I was writing the book, and I met her because I was writing about the role that race can play in policing, and her twin brother was shot and killed in Tulsa, Oklahoma. By a police officer when his car was stalled on the road. And we met, and I went to the South where she lived and talked to her for a couple days. And when my book came out, I sent her a copy of it, and I talked about her story and the suffering of her family in one of the chapters. And she called me and she told me that when the book came, she read that chapter to her parents, and she said that they sat in the room and they cried together, and they felt such a sense of relief to try to have some sense of how, not necessarily in their particular case, but how race can insert itself in really difficult situations. And I just remember feeling that I had written a book, or at least started out on this journey, just wanting to spread the word about science and what science has to say about race and the potential for racial bias. And I wanted to inform, and in that conversation I learned that science not only has the power to inform, but also to soothe. And that hadn't dawned on me before. And since that time and those discussions and that conversation, I've kept up with Tiffany and felt like the power of her story still connects us.
Great. You want to tackle that one, Jordan?
In terms of something that surprised me, I would say the way that I came to this book, the way that I found the story that would become this book. Some years ago, I work as a journalist, and some years ago I was doing some reporting in southern Turkey along the border with Syria, reporting on impacts of the war and writing a story about some people who had been displaced by the war and had fought in the war. And after a couple of weeks there, I returned to my home in Nashville and was gearing up for a trip back. And in between, I needed to find someone nearby who could translate some interviews for me, someone nearby who could call my source over in Turkey and translate the interview from Arabic into English. And so I asked around and was told to drive out to this restaurant in this town just northeast of Nashville called Hendersonville, and to just introduce myself to the chef, and that he would help me out. And so I was like, oh, okay. And so I made the drive, and the restaurant there was called Cafe Raqqa. Now, Raqqa, as I'm sure many of you know, is very famous, particularly at that time, for having been claimed as the de facto capital of the Islamic State. And I wondered, why is there a restaurant called Cafe Raqqa here in Hendersonville, Tennessee? This kind of town that blurs the line between suburb and almost kind of rural small town. And but I went in and introduced myself to the chef, and he took me to the back, and we made some small talk, and then called my source, and he gave me just incredible help with that interview. But then afterwards we started talking, and I asked that very simple question: why is there a restaurant named after Raqqa, Syria, here in Hendersonville, Tennessee? And the story he told me that day was just unbelievably compelling, and I couldn't get it out of my mind, about his own journey from Syria to the United States after having witnessed atrocities by the Assad regime as a young boy, and wanting to come to America because he believed in these ideas about America that we often like to believe about ourselves, that we had somehow figured something out to create a place where something like that might not happen. And so lured by kind of this myth of America, he came here and built a life, and the way that he told his story just captivated me and made me want to come back again and again and again. And without telling the rest of the story, I'll just say that listening to him on that day in that restaurant made me want to know more. And I think anytime you're following your curiosity and following a story that has moved you, you're going to have a really enjoyable time writing it. So that was the beginning.
Wow, that's great. Just want to make sure I pronounce your name incorrectly when I was going so fast. Ariana Neumann.
I answer to everything.
All right, give you a little extra time to think of your answer, though.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for that. So my book really is about a family history, and it's really a family histories, and it's really about the past. And I approached this very naively originally, and I interviewed, I think I spoke to over 150 people. And I would I initially approached it as I thought, okay, direct questions will give me the answers I want. And when I was being a journalist and asking people about sort of recent events, you'd ask them a direct question and they'd give you a direct answer, and that was great. When you approach family history, it's much more complex, and memories are not stored in logical ways. So if you ask a direct question, you often get a complete blank. And so what you have to do is you have to interview for much longer. You have to be friends with a person. And I think what really surprised me, for example, is I have a cousin who's much older, and I had never spoken to her about our family's past. And as I started doing research, I uncovered that there was a woman in my uncle's life, his wife, who was never spoken about, and who actually my cousin, who's a bit older than me, had met very briefly. And I kept on asking her because I was trying to trace this woman, and she's a remarkable woman called Stenka, who helped my family survive, who snuck into the camp of Theresienstadt, not once but twice, to take supplies. And she was a Gentile, she wasn't Jewish. And she was really a remarkable figure. So I kept on having these lunches with my cousin, and we would talk about the family, and I would say, "Are you sure you don't know how to find her?" And the answer was always, "No, I have no idea where she lives. I have no idea, no connection to her." And then one day, after 7 lunches, I think, we were talking about my cousin as a painter. And she was really frustrated, and she was talking about how she had this exhibit coming up, and she was just stressed. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we weren't even speaking about Stenka. She said, "I know, Stenka had a boyfriend. Her boyfriend had an art gallery in Geneva." So the connection was actually through the art rather than through direct questions. And she said, "I was really touched when I first started because her boyfriend was incredibly kind and no one wanted to exhibit my art, and he did." And then she remembered everything. She remembered his name was Yuri and he had Gallery 19, and that actually led me to find Stenka. But all my direct questions, which must have been about 300, saying, "Where is Stenka? Where is Stenka? You must know." There was nothing. So you have to let people talk, and you have to let people feel and connect, and it takes longer than you would think. But then you end up being friends with the people that you interview.
Wow,
so.
Interesting. Mike?
Xin chào quý vị. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here. After more than a year of social distancing, it feels so good to be together and celebrate literature. Thank you so much. This book has brought me so many surprises. I could talk until tomorrow, but I won't. I think, the Mountain Sing is about the 20th century Vietnamese history through the lives of 4 generations of a Vietnamese family. So I interviewed hundreds of people for this book, and I discovered each Vietnamese family has stories, has experiences that could be written into an epic novel. All of us have gone through so much. And nowadays Vietnam has developed a lot. We have moved forward a lot. And I feel like we are leaving the older generation behind because the younger generation doesn't talk to the elderly people anymore. But actually the elderly people of our country are the keepers of our history. They have so many stories that need to be passed on to the next generations. And I was interviewing the elderly in my parents' home villages, and I cannot tell you how the joy that I had in speaking with them, even though it was about the most painful experiences. I felt the need of the people to be open up about trauma, about things that they had to be, that they were forbidden to talk about. And because in Vietnam, the traumatized people are perceived to be possessed by ghosts. There's a lot of stigma associated with trauma, but I felt like the need of people to heal, to communalize their trauma so that they could heal. So I came across, incredible stories that kept me awake. During 7 nights that I wrote this book, I hardly slept, and my husband said, "This book is going to kill you." Because, I was sleeping, and then I heard my characters telling me, "Get up and write," because we cannot, our stories cannot sleep until you tell them. And I was compelled to write this novel, and I discovered many surprises about myself in the process of writing this book. Actually, I wrote the book as a way of revenge. So, with fiction, novelists can do a lot to the people whom we dislike. So in real life, my grandmother was killed in the land reform of 1945. I lost 3 family members in the Great Hunger of 1945, when Vietnam was occupied by the Japanese and French troops. So 2 million Vietnamese people died, and during that Great Hunger, my father and his sister were really hungry, and my grandma had to venture into a cornfield. She decided to steal some corn to bring home and keep her children alive. And the guard of that cornfield caught my grandma, and he tied her to the corn plants. She was too weak to break away, and she died on the cornfield. And years later, when I talked to my father, and he told me about his pain, he knew this man, and this man is from our village, and after the war, he moved away from South Vietnam. So I wanted to write this book to take revenge on him. I wanted the worst things to happen to him. But you know what I found? I found forgiveness instead. I found that the forgiveness is the best gift we could give ourselves and we could give others. Unless we know how to forgive, the circle of violence will never stop.
Wow. That's beautiful, Alex. Alex, you want to try?
Sure. So my book, kind of like Ariana's, is about the Second World War and about what my family was doing in it. So my family's German. My grandfather was conscripted into the army and fought in Russia for 4 years, and then was a prisoner of war in Russia for 3 years after the war ended. And I'd kind of grown up a bit with these stories. And the thing that I really found out when working on this book was a lot about the relationship between those two countries, between Germany and Russia, which maybe sounds a bit niche, but the thing I've learned is that for the Germans, the war is really overwhelmingly the story of the war in Russia. So we think about the Normandy landings and the Battle of Britain and Monte Cassino and all these things. But of every 8 German soldiers killed in the war, 7 were killed in Russia. And so the thing I learned and that really surprised me a lot was like how many phases the relationship between those two countries has gone through. So after the First World War, the German government and the communists in Russia collaborated with each other on breaking the Treaty of Versailles restrictions on rearmament. So essentially the Germans gave the Russians military technology in exchange for being allowed to put their own tank and aircraft factories in Russia. Which, it's all so full of historical ironies, but it meant that when they invaded Russia in 1941, they were facing German-built equipment. And then, sort of scrolling forward a bit, there used to be like a very big German community in Russia, people who'd been invited there a couple of hundred years before to be laborers, essentially. And when the war broke out, Stalin had them all arrested as potential saboteurs and sent them into internal exile in Kazakhstan, where a lot of them still live. So if you go to Almaty in Kazakhstan, there are kind of ethnic German community groups. And there are all these people still dressing up in these strange kind of peasant blouses and red waistcoats and singing these songs about the Alps, which nobody in Germany has heard for 200 years. And then when the wall came down in 1990, or when the Cold War ended, a lot of those Russian Germans got German citizenship, because the way the rules work there is like if you have German blood, essentially you can get a passport. And so a lot of those people moved to Germany, even though they only spoke Russian, and none of their family had lived in Germany for generations. One of them became my grandfather's cleaning lady, and so he would practice his Russian, which he'd learned in a prison camp 50 years before with her, and the sort of became a happy thing. The sort of bizarre outcome of all of that suffering was these people being brought together and sort of having something to talk about. In fact, one of the biggest, Germany has a kind of like folk music almost. It's kind of like country music. It's very cheesy. It's all about like people leaving their sweethearts and having to go away and be lonely and all this stuff. And it's called Schlagermusik. The main Schlager singer in Germany today is a woman who was born in Siberia, but grew up in one of these Russian-German families and then came to Germany. And so the thing that you see is the way that the relationship between these two countries goes through like cycle after cycle. The horror of the war, but also all these other things. And so, even now, Angela Merkel speaks Russian because when she was growing up in East Germany, it was part of the Soviet Union. And so when she speaks to Vladimir Putin, she speaks Russian to him, and he speaks German to her because he was a KGB officer in East Germany.
That's pretty funny.
And so I get the kind of point that I try and take out of this is that, we think about like wars and things as being sort of final acts. You have a war, and then somebody wins, and that's the end. But in reality, the other country doesn't go away. Like, it's still there. I feel like our relations with Russia, for example, are pretty bad at the moment. But Russia is still there, and it's not going to not be there. And so there's this kind of kaleidoscopic effect in the relationship in which the wheel keeps turning, and we kind of need to figure out the fact that the others aren't going away.
That's great. Really interesting. Moriel.
So, part of my first novel, Sadness is a White Bird, takes place in Salonika, or Thessaloniki, Greece. Salonika was at the turn of the 20th century, known as La Madre de Israel, the mother of Israel in Judeo-Espanol. It was a thriving, bustling, majority Jewish city where non-Jewish business people would learn Judeo-Espanol in order to do business, where the city was shut down not on Sunday, but on Saturday, on the Jewish day of rest, and where 95% of the Jewish community was killed in Auschwitz. So almost no remnant. And so part of my book takes place there, and the question was about researching for a novel. And so I was living in Jerusalem at the time, and had read everything I could find, and had, read the history books and read testimonies, but decided that it was time to go to Salonika. And this was, before I had a publisher and before my book was anything. And I said to my wife, Kayla, let's go to Salonika, Greece. And she's like, okay. So we land in Salonika, and she's like, well, what's the plan? I was like, don't have a plan. But there was one man, one blogger, who I'd read his work, a pharmacist named Yosef. And I emailed him and I said, I realized I should have written to you earlier, but I'm in Salonika now for 48 hours. Any chance you could meet? And he said, great, come this afternoon to this cafe. And he spent 7 hours with us, telling us the history of the city, telling us his family's history, telling us the ins and outs. And then he said, let's walk. And as we were walking, Yosef told us that one of his projects that he's been doing has been diving into the shallow waters near Salonika and retrieving tombstones from the Jewish cemetery and storing them in the back of his pharmacy. For what, he doesn't know yet, but to give them a place. And we said to him, could we see them? Could we come to your pharmacy? And he said, you don't need to come to the pharmacy. So he beckoned like this, walked us down the street, pointed to a building on our right, and said, look at the bottom of this building. And we looked closely, and indeed, the building is built out of a tombstone. And he said, not right there only, look at this street. He walks us down to another street, and faded, there are Hebrew letters on the street. And this was this moment where, perhaps similar to what Alex said, I had this visceral feeling, and I think it turned into a line in one of my novels, about how history never manages to wipe its tracks clean as it slumps into the present, right? The Jews were mostly deported, and the community was mostly extinguished, but there are still people like Yosef gathering tombstones in the water. There are still buildings that are built out of a literal cemetery, and you cannot understand the present of a people without understanding the past.
Wow, great. Do one more question here from this set, and it's a complicated question, but I think we're going to have to go through it a little faster just based on our timing. So, nothing. Everyone here could listen all day, but we do have a part two. You write about, I would say, dark subjects that are hard for people sometimes to read. You're writing about parts of America and parts of the world that sometimes don't show much hope. And I'm just wondering, as authors, do you have hope? Are you a hopeful person, Jennifer?
I am a hopeful person. I feel like part of what makes people less hopeful is not, expecting that we'll move backwards. But I think, I've anticipated that there's this ebb and flow, that it's not, the case that we're always going, to move forward. And it's not always the case that, whatever work we've done, no matter how great it is, that's going to be enough. And so when, I think about something like the civil rights movement, for example, where brought us lots of change, especially at the policy level and so forth, and laws changed, things opened up, the world opened up for a lot of people then, and I think there was that feeling that that the country had arrived at its promise. But then, there's the retreat, right? And I think we've experienced that a lot in this country, and I think, you know, there's a way in which we feel like if we only do this or change, you know, this law or change this policy or move in this way, then things will be okay. And I realized, I guess in my life, but also it was really underscored for me in writing the book, just that we can never rest. I mean, I think if we want peace, we always have to be vigilant and alert, and we can never feel like our job is done, and we only feel, you know, this I don't know, this idea that it's all hopeless because we have that expectation that the job should be done, and I guess I don't. So I am hopeful.
Oh, that's great. How about you, Jordan?
I would say yes as well. I would say that I feel hopeful, and for some reason, what came to mind for me when you asked that question is a moment in my book where one of the women who is a character in the book is a woman named Aisha, and she told me this story about when she and her family were leaving Turkey to take a boat, a small motorized raft to Greece, to try to move on to the rest of Europe to seek refuge there. And this moment where she is walking into the sea, and the water is coming up and coming up and coming up and coming up as they're getting deeper and deeper and about to get into the boat. And it rises almost to her head, and she has this moment of feeling like whatever happens will happen, and that I may die, I may live. If I die, she believed she would see her creator. If she lived, she believed she would build a new life with her family in a new place. And then moments later, after she was on the boat with her children, she told me this story, and she lit up as she told it, about being on this raft with several dozen other people all making the same journey. And there's a husband and a wife, she assumed, directly in front of her, and they're kind of squabbling over who has the best seat on the raft. They're arguing with each other. Like the husband wants to stretch out his legs, or there's just something about like, and they're just going at it. It's relentless, and it's quiet on the rest of the boat. But then she locks eyes with her young daughters, and they just all start cracking up laughing, and then soon everyone on the boat is just cracking up laughing at this moment. And she told that story with so much joy, and I don't know, there's something about like finding joy and humor and connection to her daughters and also to these strangers who are all witnessing this objectively strange and hilarious thing in this utterly terrifying moment that feels hopeful.
Wow, that's great. Ariana?
So I think my husband might disagree and say that I'm not hopeful and I'm very negative. But that's just because I'm I'm a realist, I'd like to think. But I think I'm very hopeful. And I think when you asked the question, what my immediate thought was, is I grew up without knowing my paternal grandparents. Not only did I not know them, I knew nothing about them. And in my 30s, I discovered this box of letters which were written by my grandparents when they were in Theresienstadt, which is a camp or a ghetto just outside of Prague. And they were there for 2 years, and I have about 100 pages of their letters. And I figured they would be absolutely filled with darkness and hopelessness. And initially when I started to read them, I would start to shake and cry, and I would have to stop. And then all of a sudden, as I read on, I found these moments of beauty and of light. And one of them actually was from my grandmother. So my grandmother was deported to Theresienstadt in May 1942. The family didn't know where she was. She was actually on a train destined for Sobibor, but she fainted in Theresienstadt. So she was dragged off the train. And ironically, that saved her life, because that train that she was on with actually her siblings and her nephews went on to Sobibor, where everybody was shot on arrival. For 3 months, my family didn't know. My grandfather and my father and my uncle, who were in Prague, didn't know whether she was alive or where she was. And then the family discovered that she was in Terezin, not so far away, Theresienstadt, not so far away from Prague. And this remarkable woman that I told you about earlier that I was trying to find, Stenka, sneaks into the camp. And when I was reading the letters, one of the letters from my grandmother, and these letters were uncensored and were smuggled out of the camp, said, I have been in the darkest of places. I have been absolutely just devastated. And all of a sudden, yesterday, I looked up, and there she was. There was my beautiful Stenka, and I saw her smile, and I thought it was a dream. And she brought me my favorite chocolates, and she brought me my favorite shawl, and she brought me hope. And I realized actually then that I had to read on. One, because the letters were filled with moments like moments of light and moments of hopefulness. So yes, I'm hopeful. And I think, just very briefly, Viktor Frankl says in his book that when he's in a camp, when he's in Auschwitz, the people that lost hope, that lost meaning, then they just gave up. So I think if you're alive, you have to be hopeful.
Relating to hope, there's a Vietnamese proverb that says, trong cái rủi có cái may. Good luck hides inside bad luck. So, for example, if I just had a terrible day and I come home and I complain to my mom, I'm desperate, I don't have hope, and she say, trong cái rủi có cái may. And I would say, that's right. So I remember when I was growing up in Vietnam, during the 80s when we were still under the American embargo, life was really difficult, and we had a patch of land, and one year there was a terrible drought, and there was no rain, and we had planted our rice, and all the neighbors had given up. But you know what my father did? He made me and my two brothers to go to the rice field with him. Each of us carry on our shoulders like some buckets, some tin buckets, and we would carry water from a long distance and water the rice field. And I remember watching the water disappear into the cracks of the rice field, and my father said, don't give up, just work, and if heaven doesn't bless us with rain, we will create water for our rice. And I learned that hope is not just about waiting for luck, but hope is about working hard towards your dreams, working hard towards your goals. And I see hope today in your presence here. I see hope in our ability to work together as a human race. Workers I'm desperate because I see so much capacity of all of us to work together better, to work towards a common goal rather than be divided like we are today. We have so much to do, but as long as we read each other, there is hope. And I have a lot of hope today. Thank you.
All right, Alex.
To put it in like very simplistic terms, one of the big things that my book is about is like how do good people end up being part of societies that do horrific things? And my kind of theory about it is that most people just kind of want to get on with their lives. They want to bring up their children, they want to be prosperous, they want to be fulfilled, they want to have a good time. And so I think, it's not really that people are bad or people are good, it's the structures that they live in can bring them to do terrible things or good things. And so I think that, on that kind of structural level, I have to say I feel like in Europe we're doing a great job at the moment. Since the Second World War, this is the longest period of peace in recorded history. Like, people have been invading each other back and forth across the Rhine since at least the 5th century. And we've stopped doing it. And the reason we've stopped doing it in large part is, there are lots of reasons. This isn't an international relations seminar, but one of them is that we've created this thing called the European Union. And I feel like a lot of people outside Europe don't really understand what it's about, but fundamentally what it is that all these countries which have been fighting each other for literally thousands of years have decided that enough is enough, and slowly, painfully, bureaucratically, they're trying to figure out how to live together and how to pool their common interests. And I think it's an extraordinary thing. I'm not one of those people who believes in the progress through history, that everything will necessarily get better. I think you can see from the collapse of previous civilizations that that's not the case. But right now, I think things are pretty good. And I think they're pretty good for very solid reasons. And so I think there is a very good reason to believe that things are looking optimistic for at least a few generations, I hope.
Such a hopeful group of authors. You should have been here a few years ago. It was a little less hopeful. Moriel, go ahead.
Well, on that note, I think I want to posit a difference between optimism and hope. So when I published my first book, I had my first reading in a little bookstore in Chicago. And before this, I'd been doing mostly activist writing. And what I mean by activist writing is writing under the religion of optimism, right? Because an activist must be optimistic. You cannot get up and attend the next protest, write the next op-ed, start the next campaign without optimism. You cannot do it if you don't at least functionally believe that things will get better. And I said in this talk, I let go of that in writing this novel. My novel ends on a darker note, on a more excruciating note than any of my activist writing had. And so I said, this is not an optimistic work. And I remember someone in the audience, and this is why it's such a joy to be talking with you, and the joy of being a writer and getting to have a back and forth with people who, frankly, may know your work better than you do, right? That as authors, we don't really know what it is we've written. We put it out in the world, and then we ask other people to interpret it for us. But so a woman in the audience, she said, I think you're wrong. I think your book is a hopeful one, even if it's not optimistic. Because your book is here. Right? Your book is a book. And that's why I think there is this consensus among the 6 of us as authors. Because a book may not believe that things will get better, but it has to believe that they could. Otherwise, we wouldn't write these books. Without that little germ of belief, that little seed that things could get better, one could not write a book. So I don't know that I'd say that I'm optimistic, especially writing about Israel-Palestine in my first novel. I don't feel optimistic that things will get better, but I do hold on to this seed of hope that they could, and I hope that my book, that these books floating around the world, could spark some little bit of change, even though it's much harder for me to say what that change would look like than if I'd been writing an op-ed where I say, in order to make a change, you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then either they do it or they don't. A book is a much stranger thing. It's a much stranger sort of hope creature, but I think that hope has to be at its core.
Oh, that's great. Actually, I just thought of a research question that I want to answer. Do you mind if I just tell you a quick research story? I was researching this woman, 90-something-year-old woman who got involved with a man who was involved in a FBI investigation for a civil rights crime. And nobody knew that she was involved in this. I was going through the FBI records and I saw her name. And I Googled it real quick and I saw that she was still alive in her 90s. And so she was a state representative for 20 years, brilliant career. And I called her up asking if I could talk to her. I think she thought maybe I would talk about the environment or her feminism, and no, I'm going to talk about an FBI civil rights investigation that she was involved because she was having an affair with this man at the time. And she was very taken back by that. She didn't really believe that someone was actually going to ask her about this, but it's part of history. I started talking to her, and she acknowledged everything. She admitted everything. And that hesitancy turned around very quickly. And as I was about to hang up the phone, I could tell she still wanted to talk. And she said, "Mr. King, can I tell you one more thing that no one knows?" I'm like, "Yes." And she goes, "I had an affair with JFK, too, in the 50s. And it went through fact-checking and no problem. We actually have a little surprise here because we had a little technical issue, but we have Alice Hoffman and Christy Lefteri, who we introduced earlier, and we're just going to ask them a question. They'll be on the screen, they'll join us, and then after that we'll get to Margaret Atwood and Gloria Steinem. So I think we're ready. Hi, Alice.
Hi.
Please accept our most heartfelt apologies for messing that up. We're all good now.
That's fine. That's life with Zoom, so that's fine.
I think everyone's used to it. I'm just going to start by asking you a question I asked the other authors, and basically it was about your writing process. And you know, you've done research, interviews, everything for your novels and past works, or maybe even works in progress. And I'm just wondering if there's anything that you came across that stands out that surprised you, and that something that in your research that surprised you.
Well, this was completely different than any other book I'd ever worked on, because usually I don't like to meet anyone that's involved, who's alive. I just want to write the book. This time I started writing in 2016. I was extremely depressed. And what I thought might be able to help me was to talk to people who had gone through the Holocaust and to try to figure out how it was possible to still have hope in a world where there was evil. And my research really began with talking to Holocaust survivors, first in Massachusetts and then in France, and survivors who had been children during the war and who are now in their 80s and 90s. It was the most amazing research and personal experience of my life. I feel extremely honored to have been able to do that and to have met these incredible people who were so full of life and who still loved life. Despite the fact that almost everyone I met, they were sent away from their parents and they never saw their parents again. So for me, it was the most incredible experience of my lifetime to get to know these people and to call some of them friends.
And I'll just follow up with another quick question. Sometimes you write about these moments in history and darkness and depression. Are you a hopeful person? Can you be hopeful with your subjects?
I'm so not hopeful, I can't even tell you. That's why I needed to No, and especially in 2016, I was very much not hopeful. But when I met people who had survived the Holocaust, and I realized how much they still wanted to live and be alive, and how much they found joy and beauty in the world, it was extremely helpful to me. And I try to remember that now in the time of COVID, that, that it's really important to keep that in your heart. It's very difficult for me to do so.
Congratulate you on the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and we'll be hearing from you tomorrow as well.
I want to thank you so much, and thank you for tonight, but also thank you. I am so honored to have received the Dayton Peace Prize. It means the world to me, and I just want to thank everyone involved. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there tonight. I'd give the world to be there, and thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Hi, Christy.
Hi everyone. Hi.
I'm going to start. I want to ask you the questions that we asked our panelists before, and I think we want to hear from you. So we talked about the writing process and research and interviews for your work, and perhaps you want to talk about a work in progress or your last book. But is there anything that you discovered on your research journey that really surprised you?
I think I'm going to have to say, I'll talk about Beekeeper. The thing that really surprised me when I was researching Beekeeper, it was a little bit like, I loved listening to Alice's answer. It really kind of touched home. Because the thing that surprised me the most was how, I guess how overwhelmed I was with emotion when I found myself face to face with people that had suffered such trauma. So, for example, when I was researching Beekeeper of Aleppo, well, before I started researching, I went to volunteer in a refugee center in Athens. So I was working in a women and children's center, and we were just basically rotating. There was a play area for children. There was an area for new mothers that had just given birth. There was an area for people to have tea and biscuits. There was an area where they could have showers, warm showers, and hundreds of people each day would come from the camps and come to the center, and the center was a safe place for them. And so I went there to volunteer before I knew that I was going to be writing this novel, and became so overwhelmed with emotion that I kind of couldn't do anything but write when I got to the UK, because I kept thinking about the people that I'd met, particularly the children. I mean, I'd watched things about the refugee crisis on the news and on TV so many times, but it's that thing of being face to face with a child who has lost everything. They don't have a roof over their head. They are living in a camp, and they don't know at all what their future holds. And when I went to the UK, all I could remember were the faces of these children and the guilt that I felt because I had a passport that could take me wherever I wanted to go. And so I decided to start writing, and then I went back the following year. And when I went back, I was actually researching, because by that point I'd actually started the novel. And I just found myself completely and almost constantly overwhelmed with emotion. And I think that's the bit that surprised me, that I don't know why it surprised me, to be honest, because I'd already felt it the previous year, but it was almost like I lost myself somehow in that space, in that kind of, in the stories of others. And because my parents had been refugees too, and I constantly had that in mind, and I was brought up in the shadow of the war that my parents had been in. And so I kind of like, I lost a sense of being able to take life for granted, which actually sounds like a good thing, but for me it became a bit of a bad thing, because then I was on this sort of path where I just could not stop thinking about the people that I'd met. So I guess I imagined that I would have been able to be a bit stronger, but in the face of it, facing all of this, I was just so overwhelmed with emotion. But then what I did was that I used that emotion, I tried to utilize it and put it into the story and use it to create characters, to structure, to create rhythm, to create emotion, to draw the reader in. So I all that emotion that I felt, I used it as much as possible. I don't know if that quite answered your question.
Christy, thank you so much for joining us. It's really just so nice to hear from you, and obviously we wish we had more time and your presence here as well. And congratulations on your Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm about to introduce two women who need no introduction, so I'll start out with the first one, Margaret. Come on out.
And now, Gloria.
You've arrived.
I did, yes.
And we are going to wait for Gloria Steinem, who also needs no introduction.
So meanwhile, I can tell you, why do I have a red purse? So I won't lose it on planes. There she is. Great.
This is great. We'll get back to that red purse. Hello, Gloria. How are you?
I think I'm all right. We'll find out.
Okay, we'll find out. I'm just going to let the two of you have a conversation, and I'll just sit here and listen and learn something. So go right ahead.
Which Gloria am I looking at? This one?
I say look at this one.
I'll look at that one.
Yeah.
Can you see me, Gloria? Am I looking at you?
Yes, I can see you sitting in this gorgeous chair.
Can you, are you looking at the
projected? Right.
You're looking at the back of my head. I hope not. It's wonderful to see you, Gloria.
No, it's wonderful to see you. You are such a source of hope, warning, women writing, the future, that you mean so much to us, so much to us.
So
And
I'm
we
remembering.
once met when you came to Ms. Magazine in New York.
I was just
and
remembering that.
Right, and that stands out as the peak occasion of the entire magazine. We had a big sign on the wall.
Oh, well, I remember that very well because I also have a picture of myself with Dolly Parton in her, a highlight in her enormous wig. I've always been a great admirer of hers. She made that wonderful comment, "It takes a lot of money to look this cheap."
I know, it's great. And she has a one-woman show that you can find on television, which is totally great, right?
And Buffy St. Marie was there too. Remember that?
Yes,
And,
absolutely.
it was quite the occasion. I
Another
was a
gift
little
from
taller
Canada,
then.
right.
I've shrunk a bit, Gloria.
You know, Margaret, I feel so lucky to be talking with you because for this past very odd year, I've been thinking about you. It's as if you wrote the year. I mean, we could not possibly.
I didn't do it. Well, it gives me the creeps. Quite frankly, it really does. And
tell us how this year has affected you.
So the COVID part or the Texas part? or all of it?
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. We live in strange times. And the other thing I was thinking, Gloria, is that you and I actually lived through the time that some of these beautiful, intelligent, smart, younger people are writing about. So we actually remember World War II, for instance. And I remember seeing Life magazine in the 40s when I was a child with those photo essays on the camps. And that made a deep impression on me, and you too, I bet.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes,
especially
absolutely.
because there were my father's relatives there whom I did not know, but I knew were there.
Exactly. So all of that, and after the war, and probably here too, a lot of people lived in the Toronto community that we had moved to who had escaped from that war. So I knew those people, and over the years I knew more people. For the Testaments, for instance, I remembered some resistance people that I had met from Poland, from France, and also in Holland. I'm old enough to have known those people. They had some pretty amazing stories. A lot of them were very young when they were doing that resistance work. And a number of them were women, because they were less likely to be suspected. Anyway, pretty interesting, and it's very interesting for me to read these books that are coming along now that people have written because they've researched, probably at about the last moment where you could talk to living people who were there. I don't mean you and me, Gloria. I mean people maybe a little bit older than us, a little bit older. History comes around because right after 1950, approx, talk about that was shut down because the West did not wish to offend West Germany too much. Remember that? So during the 50s, you really didn't hear about much of that. We'd seen it, but then it sort of vanished. And it came back, I think, with the first film I saw, and it was called Night and Fog. You probably remember that. Nacht und Nebel. Very upsetting film. And then that opened up the subject again, but you see things getting buried from history, and then you see them getting dug up and re-examined. And that's happened a lot with American history too, and it's happened with Canadian history. We are in a moment of undigging some things from the past. Because when I grew up studying Canadian history in high school, it was dead boring. It was about wheat, you know. We didn't hear about any of the really interesting, discreditable things that we had done. Sound familiar? Sure. Yeah.
So can I ask you, was this experience of the war, this dystopian, extreme experience, a source of thinking like The Handmaid's Tale?
Oh, sure.
What would happen if?
Not just the war, but the big dictators of the 20th century, including Stalin. So growing up when I did, and growing up when you did, we were familiar with some of that. And then we got more of them as the 20th century went on. We had the generals in Argentina. We had Ceausescu, who tried to make it so that every woman of childbearing age had to have 4 children. Made it a decree. You had to have a pregnancy test every month. If you weren't pregnant, you had to say why, as if it was entirely your doing. And then we had Pol Pot. And who else did we have? We had more. And it's not over. We've got more. Now, we've got more now, but they follow very similar patterns. It doesn't matter what the slogan is. The procedures tend to be very similar.
Margaret, on that point of similarity, how much do you see gender playing a role? Because although it's clear that there have been female dictators too, nonetheless, the exaggeration of masculinity seems to play an even bigger role.
Well, I once wrote a little sci-fi piece in which I said we could solve all of this by putting all the male leaders into a stadium in their uniforms, and they should sing like birds. And whoever sang the best would win. You know? And that would be so much more economical. I kind of like bowerbirds as an example. So the male bowerbird puts a great deal of attention into building the structure, and it decorates it. Different bowerbirds, some have got a bit of blue on them, some a bit of yellow, and they decorate according to their color. So the blue ones, for instance, will gather all the blue clothespins and plastic pens that they can get. Used to be flowers, but it's the modern age. And they will stick them onto their bowers. And then they parade up and down. And the females come in a group, sort of like rock concerts. And they look at each one. They look at their bowers. And then they choose the winner, and they all mate with him. So couldn't we do something like that? It would keep them all busy, keep them all busy, and there would be, an outcome. And then of course, the bowers actually test certain capabilities, like who can steal the blue clothespins from the other ones most successfully. Capitalism amongst the bowerbirds. Anyway, it's an idea. I just throw it out there.
Yeah. Well, Margaret, speaking of ideas, apparently when we were a migratory species and we were all traveling and there was much more equality. Men were carrying the children too because we were migratory. The gender roles were very different, if they existed at all.
Oh, they existed, because it's kind of hard to hunt the gazelle when you're 8 months pregnant. I'm just sharing that. So there were gender roles, and they had to do with children. But I've got a new book that I'm quite excited about. It's called The Dawn of Everything. And it's a new look at our prehistory, in which it turns out that we were much more inventive and diverse than we have been led to believe. But also, if you spend a lot of time up north, way up north amongst the Inuit, they had clear gender roles, but they were equal. And this is why. You needed a hunter, because guess what? You can't grow cabbages up there. So there are no vegans in the far north. Just telling you that. You need a hunter, but the hunter needs waterproof clothing and also a kayak, which is fitted on like a piece of clothing to the individual hunter. If the clothing leaks, the hunter will die. The family will be without food. So the sewing of the clothing is equal to the hunting of the animal. You have to be good. You have to have a situation in which these people are very good at this and those people are very good at that, and each is respected for their role, because without the other, they're done. So like that.
In this year of COVID, when we have been living somewhat differently, and one of the differences is that many more men, fathers, have been at home with their infants and small children, and have at a minimum seen what it takes, to care for and raise infants and small children. Do you think that is a source of hope, that we are beginning to humanize the role?
I think that has been going on for quite a long time. So I can remember back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it was no longer the sort of, remember those pictures of the 40s and 50s? The guy had the fedora, the overcoat, the women had the little veils. So I think that started to change already at the end of the 60s, and during the 70s somewhat. The 70s were a big age of second wave feminism making gains, particularly in things like laws and whether or not you could have a credit card, stuff like that. Tools that allowed women to have more independent lives. And I think the balancing began happening in certain layers of society then. You can never say we and have it mean every class, every section of society, because that's not accurate any more than you can say, tell me about how things have improved for women. And you have to say, well, which women? Which women are we talking about? You probably know an organization called Equality Now that I am quite keen on, because it works to equalize laws, make laws better for women and girls. Now, just having a law doesn't necessarily mean that that law will be observed, but it's a beginning.
No, well, I thank you for your support of Equality Now. I mean, it's clear that you are not only writing what is possible, but making it more possible in the real world. Do you think that men raising children, nurturing children would be helpful to getting us out of this bipartite conquered, and also the very notion of gender, which is made up?
Yeah. How many genders? There are a lot, apparently. I was just reading about a group in Indonesia that has got 5 genders. and some of the oldest cave paintings that have yet been found. So what is helpful? So I grew up in a family in which the dad didn't go to the office. Why is that? Because it was up in the woods and he was a forest entomologist, and there wasn't an office. So he was around really quite a lot. And I think my family was also a bit bizarre in that they didn't go in for, you can't do that because you're a girl. I never got told that. I did get told you can't do that because you're not old enough. You can live with that. You're going to get older, maybe. There's a point at which that ceases to be of interest, I'm telling you. But when you're 8, 9, 10, it makes sense. So I expect somewhat unusual for that generation. And when you're up living amongst the black flies and mosquitoes, you don't go in much for the pink frilly dress. Why is that? Because the black flies and mosquitoes would get underneath it. It's very painful. So I just kind of escaped that. I was, however, my mother just wasn't interested in clothes, which was a bit of a drawback. So I didn't have a mother who said, don't wear that. It would have been helpful if she it was my dad who was more interested in decorations and visual things. So, gender roles, they've always been a bit fluid. And I had a partner who was another writer, so we just shared. One of them wrote in the morning, the other one wrote in the afternoon. Very keen on being a dad, and we divided chores similarly. He wasn't interested in cleaning, big surprise, but he was very interested in cooking. So, would you like to hear my theory about why men don't see their socks on the floor? They're not moving. If they are moving, you have a different problem. Well, it's like hunters over here gathering, socks. They look a lot like mushrooms. So I'm pretty good at the mushrooms. And I think some men just don't see them. Is that right? Do you not see your socks?
Never seen one before.
He never sees them. He never sees them if they're on the floor. They have to be moving.
Once when I
Gloria's
was
not buying this.
No, I was just thinking that once when I was lecturing and we were having this discussion in the audience, and there was a woman in the front who was not participating, and I was worried about her because I thought we were offending her. And she said, when my husband leaves his underwear on the floor, I find it quite useful to nail it to the floor.
Oh, well. That's a
realized
different.
that she was definitely participating. Right.
That's a bit aggressive. So my mom was a tomboy and loved riding horses and stuff like that. Married my dad, I think, because it meant that she could go up in the woods and not have to do housework or wear hats and gloves and go to tea parties, because she much preferred that. And they made a deal, and the deal was that when they were up north, my dad would cook the breakfast, because it was often quite freezing cold. You had to get up, and there was a wood stove. But when they were in the city, she would cook the breakfast. And in the early part of their life, that really was to her advantage, because they were up there more. And then it switched a bit. In fact, it did switch. She ended up having to cook more breakfasts than before. So yeah, I had a dad who knew how to cook, and that was in the 40s.
Well, it's interesting that both of us grew up in families that were not as gendered as most of our generation.
What was yours
totally
like?
True
What was yours like,
of
Gloria?
my parents too.
What were they like?
Well, my father had 2 points of pride. He never wore a hat, which in his generation he was supposed to, and he never had a job, by which he meant that he was on the road buying and selling antiques and jewelry and so on. But it also meant that he was home much more, that we were friends, co-conspirators.
Yeah, well,
And
it's much more like that, and I think that is useful for kids to know to know both parents. But of course, then when they're gone, there's all these questions you wish you had asked them that come to you now, and you don't know the answers to them.
Mm. But it's interesting that in both of our cases, our families were somewhat less gendered, you might say, or
Quite a lot
hierarchical.
less.
We were lucky, right?
Yeah, my mom was a speed skater, among other things. And she took up ice dancing when she was 45 and gave it up when she was 75. And she was afraid she might break something. So, you know, the waltzing, the tangoing, all of that. She did that. When she was 84, she said, I think maybe it's time for me to stop climbing up on the roof and cleaning out the eaves troughs. And I said, you've been doing what?
And you think your challenge to gender roles owes a lot to your family absence of them?
It was really more or less a somewhat unconscious challenge, because if you've grown up that way and then you come into a world where you're supposed to have these fairly rigid, you think, why are you doing that? What's this for? I don't really believe that my role is to lie around on a sofa in a negligee and eat chocolates or whatever you were supposed to be doing. I just didn't understand it. So think of me as a visitor from another planet saying, what's that? What is wall-to-wall broadlimb? I just don't get it.
So would you advise parents, families, whatever form they may take, to women, to men, males,
I try not to advise.
To avoid roles?
I try not to advise people unless they ask me for advice. So, you know, I have to tie my hands to the chair, but if people want your advice, they will ask for it. But if they don't want your advice and you start giving it to them, they will think you're an interfering old bat. So I said, so my daughter's had a baby, and my friend said, zip your lip. You know nothing. And it's true, I know nothing, because every generation has their own different ways of dealing with raising their kids. Do they not? They do. I think if they see the parents doing lots of things, if they see their mom, for instance, chopping the kindling, then it's okay to wield an axe, as I do.
But you in The Handmaid's Tale, it gave us both something to fear and also something to hope for. Even at the depth of dictatorial, hierarchical behavior, you portray a man as wanting to play chess and wanting to have a chess partner so much that he's willing to play chess with a woman.
Yes, it's Scrabble, which is of course much more useful in a novel because it's got words in it. But didn't you love that wonderful series about the female chess player called The Queen's Gambit?
Yes, that was great.
Yeah, I thought she was so good. I did play chess, but badly, because I did not have the focus. I wanted things to proceed more swiftly. So my brother was a big chess player. When's it going to happen? Yeah, I was a kind of reckless chess player. I used to make moves just to see what would happen, and it's not good in chess. Yeah, so I did the follow-up book called The Testaments. I showed The Handmaid's Tale of people going into an autocratic dictatorial situation, and I did The Testaments to see how people might start coming out the other end. Because we have seen a number of these regimes rise and fall, have we not? I do have an inherent belief that people will not put up with this forever. It did last quite a long time under Stalin, I have to say. And here I'll put in a plug for that quite enjoyable film by me. I enjoyed it, called The Death of Stalin, which they played as a kind of a farce, but it's all true. They just sped things up a bit. And on the subject of them, I'll also throw in a plug for a book called The House of Government by Yuri Slescoin, which follows the fate of the Bolsheviks. They won. They moved into this building called the House of Government, which was built by draining a part of Moscow called the Swamp. So that was called Draining the Swamp. Sound familiar? They live in this Ahmad Khan's apartment building called the House of Government. And then Stalin starts the purges. And that was also called Draining the Swamp. Isn't that suggestive? Anyway, it's a great book because here are these people who'd given their all for the revolution, but made the mistake of continuing to believe in it when Stalin changed the rules. Sorry, folks, it's a dictatorship now. You have to go. A shocking book. Anyway, it finally came to a close, but you don't necessarily then get democracy, unfortunately. I think democracy is a very, very difficult form of government. You have to keep working at it. It's aspirational, but if you give up the aspiration, then you're going to end up with something much worse.
Well, I would like to point out that we did actually get rid of Donald Trump. All right.
Not so fast. Not so fast. It ain't over.
No, there are still,
as I say,
a third
democracy
of the country,
is a very fragile form, and you have to keep working at it.
Mm-hmm.
Just saying. Yeah, it's a very unusual time, and I can't remember anything this polarized since the 30s. Cannot. You were there, and you remember. So yes, pretty tense.
So could we ask what you're working on now, or is that not a fair?
Oh, it is
question?
actually, it's very fair. It's very fair for you to ask. Yeah, I have a couple of things that I'm working on. One of them is I had two previous collections of essays and occasional pieces, and the third one is coming out in March. It's called Burning Questions, and it covers the years from 2004 until 2021. So that time period. And I'm also finishing a book of stories. I will cite a cartoon from a collection of cartoons called The Snooty Bookshop. And in this cartoon, a writer is saying to an editor, "Will you publish my stories?" And the editor says, "No." And then it says, "The end." So people who write stories, especially young people, are always told, "Okay, hold the stories until you do a novel." Anyway, I am doing these stories, and so that's one of the things I'm working on, and I'm also working on a hopeful project, which is shortly to be revealed, which is not a writing project. It's a project that will address itself to the question, could we do better? Okay, we know the bad news. People say, Margaret, you've written all these dystopias. Why don't you write a utopia for once? And I say, well, it's because as a literary form, they're boring. And I've read a lot of them. 19th century was a big age of utopias. And everybody was beautiful. They all had lovely clothes. They lived in nice mansions. They'd solved the sewage system, and they're doing things so much better than we in the 19th century were doing. But then along came the 20th century, and the utopias stopped because we saw some real attempts at it that went pear-shaped. And each one of these dictatorships always came in by saying, we're going to make your life so much better, you'll love it, it'll be great, but first we have to get rid of those people. And they somehow never got beyond that spot of getting rid of those people. There were always more of those people to be gotten rid of before things could be perfect. Yeah? Yeah. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that we don't have to do better. And we have to do better, particularly in the material basis for our society, which means what kinds of buildings we live in, whether they give out more energy than they consume. That can be done. Can we make houses out of mushrooms? Yes. Can we make clothing fabrics out of algae? Yes. Are we going to do that? Open question. Mussolini made a fabric out of milk proteins. There was a drawback. When it rained, you smelled like cheese. So this is true. Would I lie to you about this? I would not. So looking at the material build and then looking at the social structures and how they could be better. And that's everything from what political form are you going to have, how will you make decisions, how will you resolve conflicts, how will you create more wealth equality, because we are in a pre-French Revolution top-heavy structure at the moment. French Revolution wasn't fun, just saying. And how will are we going to have a police force? What kind? How will we educate children? What form? What about the arts and entertainment? And people will be looking at the pros and cons of those things and trying to figure out whether such a sustainable, not only carbon neutral, but carbon negative structure could be possible. And for it to be possible, it has to be cheap enough, right? And it has to be agreeable enough. It's no good saying to people, okay, so we're going to change the way you get the water in your house. It's going to be a hand pump in the living room. They won't do it. I grew up that way. Didn't have electricity, had a hand pump, and I just ruined myself 2 summers ago by hand pumping the hand pump. I gave myself a trigger thumb. It's cured now, but you have to be able to solve these problems in a way that is cheap enough and agreeable enough, or people will not do it. Mm-hmm. How about it, Gloria? Would you live in a house made of mushrooms? They're
Yes.
baked. They're baked. They don't.
If you
look
told
like
me to, I would.
Oh, good. Thank you. Oh, yes.
No, Margaret, I would. I mean, you give us hope, and hope is a form of planning. So I'm so grateful to you. I would not want to live in a world without Margaret Atwood in it. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gloria. So nice to see you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. We hope you're feeling better, and we really miss you. And thank you so much for joining us for this special evening. Margaret Atwood, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. We're going to see you tomorrow. Really looking forward to that. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. This was a really beautiful night, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the weekend. On behalf of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, thank you.